To the man who followed me home and tried to enter my apartment, so I moved from New Zealand to Germany 3 years ago now. I was working at a hotel in Munich as a bar manager while I have been learning the language. It's ridiculously complicated, especially if English is your first language. Anyway, I am a 27-year-old blonde, thin, punky looking, you get the picture, girl. It was a 2-minute walk from my hotel to the train station, and I had to catch the train to my hometown after I finished work most nights. It was common for me to get harassed at the train station or on the way to the station, even though it was only a 2-minute walk. It was extra horrible, because I couldn't speak German very well. I once had a guy ask me to marry him for money, another one asking me why I don't speak his language because he wanted me to come home with him, another one call me a slut because I ignored him, the list goes on. But the scariest time was actually in my hometown. I live 35 kilometers away from the city. I head home on the train as usual. I got off the train and began walking round the corner to my apartment. This is around midnight on a Monday. I get to my apartment and unlock my door. But as I am unlocking my door, someone taps on my shoulder. I turn around and see a man behind me, quite short, Middle Eastern, a friendly enough looking guy. I was obviously shocked a bit, so my immediate response assumed he lived in the building. So I asked if I could help him with something. It was just so weird, so that was the first thing I said. He said in German, "I need your number." Again, I was shocked because I assumed he lived in the building and was locked out of his house or something. I was so naive. He began to tell me that he had followed me home from Munich and needed my number. I said no and that I was married. My husband was literally inside the apartment. He followed with, "That doesn't matter," and asked if he could come in. I began to freak out and stated that I was going inside, and I bid him farewell. As I entered my apartment, he pushed me forward and tried to get inside my apartment. I turned around and slammed the door so hard in his face it brought tears to my eyes, not the slamming. But you know what I mean. The creep continued to stand outside for a few minutes. I could see him through the peephole. By the time I told my husband, he was gone. I didn't even think of calling the police. I was too bewildered. The thing that scares me is that this situation could have been so much worse. I am quite fit and strong, but if I was someone smaller and stuff, it could have been really bad. If my husband wasn't there. His daughter lives here. I keep thinking of all these things that could have happened, and it still gives me nightmares. If I didn't shut the door in time, if I lived alone. All these things. Now I carry pepper spray and a whistle everywhere I go. So to the creepy man who followed me 35 kilometers home and tried to get into my house. Let's never meet again, please. The creeper that followed me home from the hospital. I'm a female in my mid-20s and I work in my local hospital. This happened last week when I finished my shift in the evening, 8 p.m. It was still light outside and I decided to walk the 20 minutes home. Whenever I'm walking, I tend to listen to music on my iPod and just zone out. Not the safest idea, I know, but most of us do it. A few minutes into my walk, I have to cross a bridge over the motorway. As you walk up the slope to the bridge, there is a small wooded area on either side of you. I could feel something or someone around me, so I casually stopped my music and had a look around me. Nothing was out of place, and I thought maybe it was me being overly sensitive. I kept the music off though, just in case, and carried on walking. A few seconds later I heard rustling behind me, and turned around startled. Again, nothing was there. At this point my heart is racing, but I'm trying to convince myself I'm being paranoid. I get to the top of the bridge and am now out in the open and can see all around, so I'm feeling a lot better. 10 minutes later and I'm nearing home and am laughing to myself about how silly and paranoid I was. At this point I'm as relaxed as I can be, and my music is back on and am just enjoying winding down from work. I've now just reached the top of the park which sits opposite my road, and am all perked up as I'm nearly home. I looked behind me. I hadn't heard anything. Or really sensed anything to my knowledge, but I'm very thankful I did look, and saw a guy about 3 foot behind me. He was that close. This guy was tall, skinny, and had greasy black hair that hung around his face. He was dressed all in black. The creepiest part was that he looked dead behind the eyes. He was staring directly at me and there was nothing there. Just blank. I turned back round and started walking at speed down the park, hoping that I was just being silly. I contemplated rummaging in my bag for my phone to call the police but didn't want to slow myself down and still at this point wondered if I was misreading the situation. The creeper carried on following me, and although wasn't as close as 3 feet anymore had still significantly kept up speed. Every time I looked behind me he was staring directly at me, still no emotion, still completely dead behind the eyes. I contemplated heading somewhere else and trying to lose him, but at this point I was terrified and just wanted to get to the safety of my house. As my house came into view I decided to just run for it, which I should have done sooner evidently. As I looked behind me I noticed the creeper wasn't running after me, but still just walking fast and staring at me. I got to my door and rummaged through my bag for my keys, completely aware that any moment now the creeper could have caught up. I grabbed them and hurriedly let myself into the house when he was 15 feet away. I locked the door behind me, and then ran up the stairs. The front door has glass panels, and our living room area has big glass doors facing the back garden. I didn't want him to be able to see me. I was shaking like mad as I edged up the stairs and looked out of our stairs window. He was nowhere to be seen. I went upstairs and looked out of the bedroom window to get a better view of the front garden, and I couldn't see him. I thought he'd gone. With my heart still racing I got my phone out of my bag and headed downstairs to call the non-emergency number. As I walked into my living room his face was pressed up against the glass peering into my house and we made eye contact. Dead eyes again. I let out quite the scream and ran back upstairs. I called the emergency number. As I waited for the police the creeper had taken a seat in my garden, cross-legged, just staring at the house. The police came within 10 minutes and picked him up. He went without any struggle. The policewoman that came told me he'd told them. I was just waiting for her. Shudder. Turns out Creeper is an inpatient in the psychiatric ward of my hospital. From what I've found out since, he'd had a bit of a fascination with me from seeing me around the hospital doing my job. Some people I know in the psychiatry unit tell me he'd been mentioning his girlfriend recently. They all thought it was another patient. They now think he was talking about me. He's been moved to another hospital now, somewhere where he can recover and I won't be afraid to go to work. And I'm hoping he doesn't have the freedom to just leave as and when he wants if he plans on creeping on hospital staff. I do hope he gets better, but I'm finding it hard to have warm wishes for him when he terrified me as much as he did. I will definitely be catching the bus from now on. To the man who followed me home from school when I was 9. I lived in an alright area. The distance between my school and home wasn't too far, so my mum never minded us walking home alone. I left school a little bit late one day, probably around 4, not that much later, but it was winter so it was starting to get dark. I noticed a strange man walking behind me and thought nothing of it, so I carried on walking until I felt uncomfortable because he had gotten closer. I decided to take a shortcut thinking there would be no way he would be going that way. He followed me up the path and through the shortcut. Now freaking out I decided to start jogging, trying not to make it obvious, but he started speeding up and almost jogging too. I was small so my jogging was probably his speed walking. I got close to home and ran up my path to turn into my garden. I then turned around to see that he had followed me up the path until he saw me reach my garden. He literally just turned around and walked back the other way. I don't know what his intentions were, nor do I want to know, but I ran in the house and straight upstairs to my bedroom and just started crying. 10-15 minutes later my mum came up and asked me what was wrong. I told her and she asked why I hadn't come straight to her when I came in. That was the last time I wanted to walk home from school. So to the guy who followed me home when I was 9, now 18, let's not meet. He followed me home. I'm a 26-year-old female from Michigan, but I was 20 at the time this took place. I live in a safe town and I was working at a Walmart in the next town over, which is an even safer town. I worked midnights because I am definitely not a people person. Every day I would go home on my lunch to see my new puppy, who to this day has kept me going through countless problems in my life. Working midnights, there were basically Northwest cars on the road when I was going home on my lunches. It was when I was 4 miles from work at a stoplight that I noticed a car had been behind me for a mile or two. I drive like a grandma and always go the speed limit, so there wasn't a reason for someone to stay behind me with clear open road all over. I keep on my way home. The car is still behind me another mile. I thought, okay, that's weird, but maybe coincidence. I then had to turn on a side street with only has neighborhoods along either side for about a mile. You guessed it, the car turned too. I started to get worried but still brushed it off. Maybe they lived down that street. It was when I turned into my neighborhood I started to lose it when the car was still following me. I turned down my street, but didn't pull into my driveway because I didn't want to lead this creeper to my house. So I kept driving and took another way back out of my neighborhood. The car's still following me. Just to be positive, before I called 911, I drove through my neighborhood the same way as before and he followed again. I got back on the main road from the side street and called 911, crying because I was terrified, and explained the situation to them. I headed back towards my work. She asked where I was and I told her the crossroads, and lucky me, there was a patrol unit a mile up. Yet the car's still following me. She stayed on the phone with me and told me to pull into the 7-Eleven at the crossroads the police were close to. The car pulls in after me too. The dispatcher lady told me to turn my hazards on so the police know which car was which. The car must have seen the police car and tried to leave. Not today, buddy, they stopped him on his way turning out. I was just parked in a spot crying hysterically. An officer comes over and asks if I know a Michael Stonebreaker. I say no, I don't. The officer continues to say he has a good amount of heroin on him and this isn't his first arrest, so he'll be going away for a while. Why did he follow me? What was his motive? The officer also said the creeper said he was following me because he thought I was his friend. Well, why didn't he pull up to me at the red light we were stopped at? Why wouldn't he have tried to get my attention somehow? That was a very terrifying experience for me, even if it doesn't sound scary to some of you. This taught me a valuable lesson though. Please pay attention to your surroundings, day or night. Anything can happen anywhere. Even in a safe town. To the guy who followed me home. When I was 23, I rented an apartment in an old boarding house in a neighborhood just outside the sketchy downtown of a mid-sized southern US city. One night, around 2 a.m., I was driving home from my boyfriend's place after we'd had a huge fight. I was teary, and not paying much attention to my surroundings. At a stoplight, I pulled up alongside the only other car on the road, made brief eye contact with the driver, and gave him a quick, absent smile. I'm Southern. It's ingrained. Anyway, I guess he took that as some sort of invitation. At the next stoplight, he stared intently into my car with a weird, blank expression. And at the next, and the next. I was seriously uneasy. But it took me a while to realize he was actually following me. I should have driven to a police station, but this was before smartphones, and I didn't know where the closest one was. Also, I was exhausted, and guess I thought I was just being paranoid and didn't want to make a fuss. Instead, I circled around out of my way, until I no longer saw his headlights behind me. It seemed like he got bored and veered off. I was beyond relieved and drove straight home, anxious to get inside and behind locked doors. I parallel parked in a tight spot between two cars on the street outside the boarding house and cut the engine. And that's when he pulled up alongside me, close enough to the driver's side door that I couldn't have opened it if I tried. I was blocked in, and now he knew where I lived. I briefly thought about climbing across and exiting by the passenger door, but I wasn't confident that I could outrun him to the house and get it unlocked before he grabbed me, if that was his intention. It was very much the vibe he was throwing off. I fumbled my phone, and while I was fishing it out from under my seat, he got out of his car, lazily walked around to the passenger side of mine and tried the door. Finding it locked, he leaned down and stared at me with that same intent, dead-eyed expression, and started tapping at the glass. I got my phone open and yelled that I was calling the police as I dialed 911. He began banging on the window, then slamming his fist on the windshield like he was trying to break it. Then he stopped cold and just stared for a long minute more while I talked to the dispatcher, looking utterly disappointed in me. I don't clearly remember the end of the interaction. It was a long time ago, and I was terrified and trying to give information over the phone, but I remember having the impression that he was making a mental note of the house, and that he seemed entirely confident as he ambled back to his car and unhurriedly drove away. The cops came and took my statement, and didn't seem to like what I told them one bit. If they found him, though, no one ever let me know. I lived there for a few more months, and didn't get a single solid night's sleep.